Hey guys, welcome to lesson 5, part 2. And in this lesson, we are going to take different pieces of information, kind of like what we did in part 1 to make equations, and we're going to kind of make sense of it as it applies to these different word problems. So let's go ahead and take it away. So this one talks about low tide and high tide. And I don't know if you guys have ever been to the beach before, but if you do, you'll know that high tide and low tide is very cyclical. So it starts at high, and throughout the day it goes to low tide, then it goes back up to high tide, and then you just do this every single day. It repeats, and so that's what this problem is talking about. So high tide occurs every 12.5 hours. So we're going to apply this to what we know about trig functions. So think about every time high tide occurs. So I kind of am thinking about this as maybe a cosine function. So from here to here, this is going to be our period. So think about like our time period. That's going to be our period. Okay, so it gives us exactly when high tide occurs and how high tide is and how low tide goes. And we are trying to find out where it will be at 9:05 a.m. So we have these pieces of information, and I would definitely start with, this is the first thing that's jumping out at me, that's the period. And I'm going to create a graph based on like what we've learned so far. So I'm kind of starting here, and I'm going to eventually write an equation. So that's going to be my B. So the next thing that I noticed is that high tide, so this is like a time. So I think like I'm going to think of this as midnight. And so 2:45 a.m., that is 45, that is 3/4, so 2 and 3/4 of the hour. And I'm going to start there. So that's going to be my shift. So from that, I know that, I'm going to change colors. I know that my high tide is 5.3 feet above the beach level. So right here. And it occurs at 2:45, which is 2.75. So what I'm thinking about next is if my period is 12.5 and I start at 2.75, then 15.25, that's going to be my next high spot. And it's going to be back up to that 5.3. So remember how I said that everything was very patterned. So I am going to figure out my low tide is halfway between these 2 points. So we have this 12.5, and I'm going to divide it by 2, and that's going to give me 6.25. And so to find this middle point right here, I'm just going to add that to the 2.75, and that's going to give me my middle point, which is 9. So I know that my low tide is happening at 9. And do we know how low the low tide is? Let's see. Low tide is 2.3 feet below the piling. So like below the beach. That's going to be a negative 2.3. Negative 2.3 right there. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is figure out that wave of axis or axis of symmetry. And so it's going to be halfway between here and here. So see if we can figure that out. Okay, so I figured out that it was y is equal to 1.5. And how I did that is I took 5.3 minus negative 2.3, and I got 7.6, and then I divided that by 2, and that gave me 3.8. This is going to be my amplitude. And so I knew that it was 3.8 between here and here. So you can either subtract 3.8 from 5.3, or you can add it to negative 2.3. Either way, you're going to get 1.5. So that is that equilibrium position right here that we've been talking about. So now I think I have everything that I need for an equation. So I'm going to go ahead and start writing on that. So my A, which deals with my amplitude, that is 3.8. So it could be positive or negative, and so it starts up, goes down, starts back up again. So it's going to be a positive. Again, it's a cosine. My B, we already found that, is 4 pi over 25. And I shifted it to the right, 2.75. So it's going to be minus 2.75. And our midline, or that wave axis, is 1.5. And so this is my equation. So now that we have our equation, now we can answer this. Where will the tide, where will the water be at 9:05 a.m.? So the first thing that I'm thinking about is 9:05. That's going to be like 5 over 60. Or about 9.083333, repeating. So that is going to be my x value. So think about our chart. So this is our time axis down here and how high our water is for our y-axis. So I'm going to plug in this value, the 9.083 for x, and then my y value is going to be the height of the tide. So if it's positive, it's going to be above the piling on the beach, and if it's negative, it's going to be below. So if you did it correctly, your answer for y should be negative 2.3. So what this means is that it's going to be 2.3 feet below, the pilot. And so if we think about this from a common sense perspective, that should make sense because our low tide is going to be at 9 a.m. and it was just a little bit after, 5 minutes after low tide. So it should be right around there, and it was. And we're done with that problem.